Welcome everyone to the online information session on the Council's Draft Disability Inclusion Action Plan 2022 to 26. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay our respects to the ancestors and spirits, past and present. We'd like also to acknowledge and pay our respects to any Aboriginal persons joining us today. I'm Rebecca Orcombe, Director of Community and Library Services here at North Sydney Council, and this is Judy Harwood, the consultant who has prepared Council's new plan. The purpose of today's session is to provide an overview of Council's new Disability Inclusion Action Plan and provide an opportunity to send through questions. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. This session is being recorded and will be made available from Council's website. All participants' microphones will be muted throughout the session. If you are participating via a computer or smart device, you can use the chat function to submit a question during the session. All questions will be collated and responded to at the end of the session, inclusive of pre-submitted questions. I'll now hand over to Judy, who will take you through our plan.
Good afternoon or good evening from where we sit, and welcome to anybody who's joining this video. It's been an absolute pleasure working on this project and making sure that we have a practical product at the end that works for everybody. I just wanted to start by giving you a little bit of context. We've got a legislative requirement for councils to have a disability inclusion action plan. This is under what's called the Disability Inclusion Action Act, and it, along with lots of other legislation, actually.
Sorry. We've got plenty of time.
We've got plenty of time. So we've got a range of legislation that actually requires us to do this and to make things better. And I have to say, we're in a much better place than 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we really didn't have the legislative framework that we've got now that requires new buildings to be accessible. We didn't have the requirement for disability inclusion action plans. And we didn't have, I guess, the mindset to ensure that our community works for everybody. So we've come a long way, but we've got a lot of mopping up to do. And we've got a long way to go to actually make things fair and equitable for everybody, including people with disability. These plans, these disability inclusion action plans, help government, help local government, help other organisations that have one to understand what might get in the way of somebody participating and being included in their community or in the events around us. And it documents and sets a direction about how to avoid or mitigate or get rid of some of those barriers. It's also a very public commitment to making the council, this LGA, this local government area, accessible to people with disability. It's written down, you see it, the public sees it, there's accountability systems this end at council to make sure that what they say is going to happen, happens. This is North Sydney Council's second plan, so we're actually building on some of the things they've already done. Now, just to take you through how we've approached this, it's taken us about 6 months to get to this point. We started with some surveys, and we had 2 surveys. One was a staff one and one was an open one to the community. And then while that was happening and ongoing across a couple of months, we started talking to people. And we had a stakeholder panel of people with disability. It was one of the first things we did. We did some individual interviews. We talked to service providers. We talked to the Aboriginal Heritage Office. we talked to people in council. So we did a lot, I did a lot of talking, and I was really grateful to the people who actually joined us in those conversations, because it was those conversations that helped us shape and make the plan what it is today. We took a little bit of time to write it and make sure those actions worked. Sometimes we bundled those actions together, and we refined it. So we prepared the DIAP through May and July. It's been on exhibition most of this month, and it will stay on public exhibition for comment until the 12th of September. So anyone listening in, if you'd like to put some more feedback in, you certainly have the opportunity until the 12th of September. At which point the DIAP or the plan will be finalised and put out there and start to work on it. Rebecca will be very busy, I'd say. Yeah. So how we developed this plan? As I said, first of all, we started to talk to people, and very central to its development was the stories, concerns, issues, frustrations, ideas of people with disability, their carers, their friends. And we started with a really great group of people with disability in a forum, and some really great ideas came through that. And I'm hoping that if anybody from that group watches this or has a look at the plan, they'll see much of what they were discussing mirrored in the plan. We also conducted a survey, and it was really interesting to find out some of the results of that. It was quite a detailed, lengthy survey, and I really appreciate anybody who filled that in. We had focus groups, individual interviews, and we also sought feedback on the draft from the Australian Network on Disability and many, many other ways. I know that Council has emailed and asked many, many people in their database to provide feedback. And of course, we also listened to the Disability Service Providers and Aboriginal Heritage Office. So after we talked to people, and that was mostly about talking to people in the community, we then overlaid that with conversations, and it was quite iterative in the process, conversations with the council, because it's one thing to have great ideas. It has to be doable, has to be workable from a council perspective. Not only that, council also knows what has been done before and where the budget sits for things. So we had to make it practical, we had to make it doable, we had to get the ownership from within council. And I can't quite remember how many people staff came to a focus group, but it was, that was a really good, energetic group as well, giving us their ideas, their information from working on the ground. We had an enormous number of people from council respond to the staff survey. So really good buy-in from the council as we developed this plan. What was really good around the surveys as well were the comments that people put into the survey, where they could put in some free text. That was often really useful. So we had an iterative process of building the plan where we talked to people, we started honing those actions, we'd talk to people a bit more, we'd hone them a little bit more. We also talked to the elected representatives, some of the mayors, and I had a few one-to-one conversations with the elected representatives. I had a fabulous session with the mayor, just one-on-one, and I can tell you she is absolutely enthusiastic about this plan. I think it goes to her heart as a designer, an urban designer, and I was really pleased about the buy-in from the people who will be leading this plan. Also, quite a number of discussions with the managers and the executive managers from council who will be taking and leading this forward. And I think also you did a session with the managers in each section.
And they gave good feedback too.
Excellent. So many conversations, making sure that the plan was doable and had budget where it was needed. This is a 4-year plan, so it's going to take us forward. It's not going to fix everything, but it's certainly going to take us forward. And it will also build on what's already been achieved. Okay, how the plan was written. I don't know if anyone listening to this has been involved with developing up a disability inclusion action plan. There's a few things that you need to keep in mind as you read this plan. It needed to be absolutely meaningful for council. So we tried to avoid jargon. We tried to avoid anything that looked too technical that the general public may not understand, or not everybody would understand. We tried to give a little bit of background so that people knew where the actions were coming from. So for the community, that was really important. We tried to summarise things before we went into a more detailed plan, so it was easy to read. But it also had to be useful for council. So if you look at the plan towards the back, there's a more detailed area that actually has timeframes and who's responsible. So trying to make it work for readers across the community as well as council. It needed to have synergy with the North Sydney Council's values, absolutely critical. And if you pick up the plan, you'll be able to see those values up there, left, right and centre. And also the other council strategies, plans and accountability systems. So this is not a plan that sits in one section of council. This is a plan that rolls across all of council. So absolutely every area in council has a role to play in making sure that we get better about making things fairer and more equitable and more inclusive in our community. And I don't think there's an area left out in this plan. Rebecca's area probably coordinates much of it, but every area has some responsibility in this plan. The actions needed to be fairly high level, and it was getting a balance between making them meaningful and not too vague, but also not making them so detailed that it was about, fixing up that curb on that street. So we tried to bundle things together where we could, and we tried to be specific where it made sense. And you'll note that there's actions in the plan, and then there's a number of sub-actions, more detailed information about what will happen in the plan. There had to be enough detail to be accountable, but not too granular. And we did not want to capture in the plan what was required of council under legislation. So when council does a new curb, for example, there are requirements about how they do that now. There's legislated requirements about how they do that. We didn't want to capture that. We wanted to capture the things that either fixed up things that had been not done so well in the past when we didn't have a focus around being fair and equitable around disability. So we wanted to capture that. And we also wanted to capture what took us beyond what was required. So beyond business as usual. We did not want to capture just the things that were business as usual. And we also wanted to use principles of universal design so that it's good for absolutely everybody. And it is about just good design. In the end, this is about designing well for everybody. It's about making sure people, the words that come to mind for me, making sure that people can move around our community and do things as independently as they want to. that they have confidence in what they're doing and where they're going and what they're seeing. That there's a degree of predictability in what they're seeing, that there's options about how they access information and do things, and that there's continuous paths of accessibility so they can get from A to B and there's no hiccups in between. So there's sort of the range of things that we wanted to make sure that we were looking at in this plan and that it was easy for people. Okay, now the New South Wales government has actually done some guidelines about how to do a disability inclusion action plan. And in that, it outlines 4 areas to focus on: community attitudes and behaviours, livable communities, employment, and systems and processes. They're the 4 areas that you will consistently see in a disability inclusion action plan. So they're not just unique for North Sydney. They're fairly standard through plans, and that's partly because in the olden days, years ago, if we did do a plan around disability, we tended to skew it around a couple of things. And this keeps our focus much more broadly. So I'm going to take you through each of those areas a little bit and tell you what we've put into the plan. Okay, so that first area is about community attitudes and behaviours. I said before that the surveys gave us some really good information to work from for this plan, but it also highlighted that we've got a bit of work to do. So 33% of the respondents in that survey felt that they'd been discriminated against in the last 12 months. They were people with disability. And that's a pretty big chunk of people when you think 1 in 6 people have a disability in our community. That's a pretty big chunk of people who feel like they've been discriminated against. And we know from evidence that much of that is about when somebody walks into a shop and wants to purchase something or participate in something. And it's also around employment. Employment's a huge area of discrimination. And the other thing that came up as we talked to people that was quite unique, I think, for our times, was how vulnerable people felt, and the understanding that people may or may not have in the community of those who might be fairly vulnerable around COVID and other things, vulnerabilities in the community. So for immunocompromised people, they particularly felt very vulnerable at this time, and they felt that people in the community really didn't have an understanding of how their behaviour may affect them as a person with compromised health. In particular, they were worried about masks. Their disability, their health conditions aren't visible. And many of the people that I talked to were actually just staying inside and not coming out in the community because they felt too vulnerable. So it was a particular issue that came up around the last few years and how people felt. So some of the things that we put under that first area, I'm not going to outline. As I said, we've got a major action and then we've got some sub-actions under each of those. Under 1.1, I'm just going to say that I guess we'll be looking particularly around the influencing role that council has with businesses and services to help them understand and be more aware around disability, community centres and doing a bit of training in there. and making sure that it's easier and safer for people with disability to confidently and safely access services and other things in the community. So highlighting some of the things that would make it easier for them. So that's in that first area. Area 2 is about livable communities, and I guess that's a big chunk of work for council. Okay, this is core business for council, making sure that their communities are livable. And I've just popped a few photos up here just to show you the sort of things that we saw and discussed as we went around our discussions for this plan. So certainly in our plan, we've got some actions around the council chambers, making sure that it's easy to get in and around the council chambers. And once you're in, that's easier. You'll see some actions. The second slide there is just opposite the coal loader for anybody who doesn't recognise that spot. Making sure that parking works better for people, making sure that the coal loader is optimised around making sure that people with disability can be involved and welcomed there, particularly around some of the Aboriginal Heritage Trail there, public toilets and our parks. So they're just a few photos to show you some of the issues that we saw along the way and discussed. So we tried to keep real things in mind as we looked at the actions. And you can see this is one of the bigger chunky areas for council. Not the only area, certainly it's a big area. So in that first one, 2.1, improving access to North Sydney's facilities, in particular, that's about the chambers and offices and community centres. 2.2, increasing the accessibility of the coal loader, parking bays, making sure people had some of the paths weren't joined up, so you get to some bits of the path and couldn't jump to the next accessible bit around the coal loader. There's opportunity to make sure that the Aboriginal Heritage Trail is accessible, to include some Auslan tours and making sure that people know how to get from A to B. 2.3, improving access to public toilets. Now, in particular, I wanted to highlight a couple of things in this area. So we want to, one of the actions, one of the sub-actions in this is to actually install an accessible adult change facility in Bradfield Park. This local government area does not have any adult change facilities for people with adults usually or older children with complex disability and complex personal needs. There's no facility at the moment in all of the LGA, and we thought that Bradfield Park was a fairly central place to target for that. And upgrading some of the accessible public toilets that we've got. 2.4, making it easier, safer and more predictable to confidently navigate places and access services. And one of the people I spoke to who was blind, he said, look, there's places I don't go because it's just too unpredictable. It's like an obstacle course moving from A to B. And so we want to make sure that that's easier, safer and more predictable. 2.5, look, we've got amazing spaces in North Sydney Council area, and we want to make sure that they're suitable for everybody. And just to pick a couple of things that we're going to do, that Council is going to do under that action, they're going to develop a new intergenerational outdoor fitness area in partnership with people with disability. So they're not just going to do it, they're going to do it in partnership and make sure that it's documented along the way about that process. And they're going to make sure that there's they upgrade some of the playgrounds in the area. Improving the access to the harbour vicinity. We've got some amazing locations, but not all of them are accessible. In particular, one of the things I wanted to highlight is they're going to make sure that there's some a drop-off zone and better parking around the harbour bridge so that people can access. We've got the lift on the harbour bridge now, and we want to leverage off that opportunity. And improving the accessibility to library services. I have to say, one of the things that came up in the consultation over and over and over again was how much people appreciated the library services. There was just fantastic feedback about how helpful they are, but also some good ideas about how to make that better. And so there's quite a few actions that sit underneath that about how we can improve the accessibility to library services, which are so valued in our community. The third area is employment, and I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of, or a few quite sobering points, and there's been quite a bit of media around this of late in the last few weeks, because we haven't made much of a dent in improving the situation for people with disability in employment. And I think that's probably, the data would probably show that's got a bit worse through the pandemic. So people of working age with disability are twice as likely to be unemployed as those without disability. And that's particularly bad for younger people, that 15 to 24 age group. They're very disadvantaged or excluded from the workforce compared with others. And there's that discrimination one again on that third dot point. 1 in 5 people with disability aged 15 to 24 experienced discrimination. And in almost half of those, it was about the source of discrimination was an employer. So council has a role around themselves as an employer, and we've got significant number of actions around making sure they can do that well. And I think they'll be drawing on the enthusiasm and the huge goodwill that came through from staff during the consultations to make that happen. They'll also be trying to use procurement and some of the ways they can leverage through procurement. I'm just catching up on my notes here, I've gone ahead. And the other area they're going to look at is around artists. So the picture that was on the introductory slide from this presentation was from somebody from Studio A, and there's a few actions to make sure that that organisation, which does fantastic work around professional artists with disability, have a home to where they can work from. They've got to move at the moment, so that's important. And I think council has a couple of their paintings around the council chambers as well. They're also going to support an artist in residence. So making sure that there are some really practical ways to work around employment. And the fourth area, the last area, so there you can see the 3 areas that they'll be working in. And then the fourth area is around systems and processes. So when you think of that, you often think about websites, and they're making sure that their website works as best as it can, and making sure that the information they provide on that website is accessible around screen readers and that sort of thing. Also making sure that the websites that are associated with each location, so for example, North Sydney Oval or the Coal Loader, or the playgrounds has information about accessibility on there, has photos that people can see. It has really useful information that people can use in making a decision about whether they go there or not. Providing information in a range of formats, including this plan. Better utilising the systems to understand and support employees with disability, and making sure they feel comfortable in working with their manager so they get the best outcome from their employment. 4.4, ensuring that these council strategies and designs are well informed and accountable. And 4.5, enabling and fostering civic participation. I think the one thing we've learnt through the pandemic is how to use online systems well, and making sure that we use those to the best of our ability, not just so that people can see what's happening, but also so that they can participate in what's happening from afar. And that also goes to supporting people with immunoconditions as well, where people may feel safer or it's easier for them to participate from home, making sure those systems work. And then governance and accountability. This plan is going to be overseen at the senior management level, but they're also going to work in consultation with a brand new Disability Advisory Committee, which is not in place yet, but it's one of the actions in this plan. And that group will work strategically to help council understand how it's moving forward and how it's working on this plan. There will also be progress reports in the council's annual reports, and it will also go to the Disability Council New South Wales. Now, both those things in that second dot point are actually required by legislation. And of course, council would love to hear your input along the way. So there's an email, you can email them at any time with ideas, suggestions, maybe some, experiences that you've had along the want to way. So that's it from me, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you,
I'm going to hand
Judy.
over to you.
All right, I'll just close. But thank you to everyone for taking the time to attend or watch today's session. We hope it has been informative and provided insight into Council's draft Disability Inclusion Action Plan. The plan will be on public exhibition until Monday, the 12th of September. So we encourage you to review the draft plan and let us know your thoughts and your feedback. In order to see it, just go onto Council's website to the Your Say section of it, which is usually on the right-hand side, or you can read a hard copy, have a look at a hard copy of it in Stanton Library. If you have any additional questions not addressed by today's session, please email yoursay@northsydney.nsw.gov.au and council staff will endeavour to provide a prompt response. Thank you to you all again.
Thank you, everybody.